Welcome back to the One Question Leadership Podcast. I'm Glenn Caruso, head football coach at the University of St. Thomas, and so happy you tuned in. You know, quite often we get so caught up in the daily grind of work or coaching or recruiting that we don't often take time to reflect. I would encourage everybody to take just a few minutes each day to try and see the bigger picture, to stop and realize that in the end, we're going to be judged on what we choose to believe, who we choose to love, and what we decide to leave behind in the hearts and minds of not just our players, not just our coworkers, but also our children. And remember, if we're doing it right, we're coaching football for life.
Greetings, this is Ty Brown, and welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast, where we highlight executive and organizational leadership. Our guest today is Coach Todd Berry. Coach Berry is the Executive Director of the American Football Coaches Association. Greetings, Coach. Thanks for joining us again.
My pleasure, Ty. Anytime.
Now, Coach, you've been in that position as Executive Director since January 2016, I believe. Prior to that, you coached football for 34 years. You were the head coach at Illinois State, Army, Louisiana Monroe. The American Football Coaches Association is pretty much the only organization which collectively represents all of American football, from high school through junior college, semi-pro, professional, and international American football coaches. Of course, I worked there for a long time, so I have a passion for what coaches represent. So I'm really happy to have you on here.
My pleasure, Ty. You're absolutely right. I think that one of the things that, even in this pandemic, I think the one thing that some of the individuals out there, I mean, when I talk about it, I'm talking about all the different committees that I'm a part of. They kind of recognize that there is one entity out there that kind of represents all of football and doesn't have a regional bias or, a divisional bias. And so consequently, it's been a very, very active time period for us.
So that's the question I have. I think I want to lay the groundwork for this conversation with this. Can you tell me what committees the AFCA is represented on, either you or a member of the Board of Trustees or some type of representation in terms of the structure of, for the most part right now, college football?
Yeah, I won't get down into the weeds on some of them because some of them are subcommittees, but I think that the main ones obviously are football oversight, which is the group that represents FBS, FCS, and is kind of the finality, if you will, of where everything goes before it moves to council and those votes. One of the, I think, significant committees that were basically reports to oversight is competition. And competition is basically playing rules and other rules that basically govern the games, practices, some of those kind of things. I'm also part of the Sports Science Institute's task force in relation to injury updates and reporting. And so consequently, annually, and then obviously now via the phone, we get together and have conversations in relation to health and safety issues, going to around the sport. I'm on the bowl subcommittee, handling the bowls and the number of bowls and so on. And then there's been a couple other committees that have formed out of the pandemic that are kind of allowing for there to be a little bit quicker path maybe to some information. And because of our access to our coaches, there's opportunities to, for me to maybe engage faster than anyone else with our coaches to get some inputs, because obviously this is somewhat dynamic and certainly very fluid.
Yeah, it's definitely dynamic. And all those committees you named, there's definitely a lot of input that coaches have in terms of the machinations of college football. I wonder, in talking to your membership, I know you talk to various coaches every day almost. Tell me about what's on their minds during this pandemic in terms of the guys that play on their teams.
Well, I think just like everyone else out there, everybody would like to have, great information in relation to return. We all recognize that it's coming. And I think there's enough information out there in relation to, how to take care of yourself and some of those other kinds of things. And so now it's all about, when do we get back? And I think we're certainly looking forward to that. And I think we will. I have no doubts that football will be played this next year. It might be different than what we've seen in the past, but we'll play. And I think, what I try to tell our coaches is, we have to learn to shift and adjust, and there's probably no better profession in the world that's used to doing it. We do it every Saturday or Friday night or Sunday on game day, and there are no certainties in football, and so consequently, you've always got Plan A, Plan B, Plan C, and so on, and that's we need to handle it kind of similarly as what we do at game day.
Right, and you think about the possibilities of a football season. You see all kind of speculations out there. And I imagine maybe some of the committees you're on, or even some of the coaches you talk to, you have to all those plan A, B, and C, 6, 7, 8, 9, all the way to Z. How would coaches plan for various starts? I mean, you think back how many weeks before you can actually start training? I mean, football is it's not a 2-week show up, run a little bit, lift weights, and go hit somebody type thing. You know what I mean? There's a whole mental conditioning aspect to it, in addition to the physical part, which I don't know if everybody understands.
Yeah, very much so. I think that you're absolutely right. I think most of our student athletes are in condition, and and we have had those conversations, and certainly, as you mentioned, everything's been modeled out from A to Z. I think one of the things that our board talked to yesterday was, and at the suggestion of some of the committees, was what does a preseason look like? And certainly there's been, a 6-week model would be ideal. A 5-week model would be okay. A 4-week model can be done. And I think that's kind of what our board suggested yesterday, because, quite honestly, that's obviously what we used to do. We certainly have student athletes that are transfers or junior college transfers or so on that miss all of the summer, and we get them ready in a 4-week time frame, and then obviously if you look at all the data points from our Division 3 brethren, they have not even that really in terms of time, and they get teams ready. And if you look at the data points in relation to health and safety, they're as safe as any group out there in relation to that. So, it is a little different. Ideally, we like to have 6 weeks, but I think the minimum is 4. And so, to get back to kind of one of your original questions in relation to when do you start, I think it's basically the 4 weeks after we get the all clear. We think we can do it in 4, and so 4 weeks after the all clear, if it's September the 1st, then October the 1st, we'll be ready to start playing. But you're right in the sense that it's not just the physical conditioning side of things. It's also getting your body in position to safely have contact. And that's one of the things that I think people outside of the game really maybe don't understand as much. You need to put your body in a position to where when you have contact, you can safely have contact, and that's you just don't go out there and start throwing your body around all over the place.
Yeah, there's a lot, even in what you just said, the 4 weeks. I mean, they give you the clear on September 1st. We got to get everybody to campus. And obviously, it's like sitting on G waiting on O, right? Everybody shows up, let's go. That aspect of everything is like, you got to get your eyes on everybody. Is anybody? I mean, obviously, the athletes are training and getting ready and doing the best they can. But there's a whole lot of, I guess, the habits, right? You got 4 weeks to get into habits and practice, and then they're getting accustomed to being back in classrooms. There's a whole aspect of a whole lot that would happen in that time. And obviously, like and I know, sports are one of the most important things when you're looking at leadership and people looking for normalcy. What I call the doomsday scenario, right, which may or may not be a doomsday, but if the football season doesn't happen in the fall, I've heard some people talk about January and February and all types of spring or winters. My question relative to that is, if you were to have a season start in the spring or winter, like at what point in the future would you get back to a season being in the fall, right? Because at some point you either have to have 2 seasons in a year, which I think Kirk Ferentz, he kind of hinted at that it's kind of crazy to do that because there's health and safety aspects. Or would you just have, and this is all speculation, Coach, and you got to forgive me, but would you just have a 4 or 5 game season, which essentially are just revenue games in this winter and spring. So people can bring in some type of revenue. You can get accustomed to playing football, and then you go have a regular season in the fall. I mean, that's to model that, I think is kind of the interesting part in terms of the minds that are way smarter than mine, right?
Well, I think that it certainly everything's always going to revolve around health and safety. I don't think there's any doubt that any group out there they want to play the game safely, and so consequently, the medical community is going to have a big say in something along those lines. There certainly, as you mentioned, have been models that have been modeled out for a spring season, and I have no doubts that we'll play football this next year. And I think that at some point in time, obviously, this pandemic is going to go away and life will return to normal one way or the other. And so consequently, there will be the opportunity. And in that same vein, then we have to try to configure a model that fits the time of when we do come back. And it might be a spring model, as you mentioned. It might be I'm not sure if it would be a full season. It might be one of those things, as you mentioned, as a revenue generator. I think that many right now that even those that maybe were not necessarily supportive of football, it was not their favorite sport, have really kind of been a little different in the conversations right now about football, because I think everyone is kind of starting to understand a little bit more about the revenue generation that football has for a university, and not just for the athletic program, but for the university as a whole. And so consequently, that would obviously be one of the driving forces is for people to feel like they're back to normal, which I think has certain value, and some would want that. But also from a financial standpoint, there is going to be a need to have it. Now, in relation to the following season, I think a lot's going to be dependent upon, how many games you have, how much the roster you can use during that time frame, how it's going to count in terms of eligibility, and how much that's going to impact the next fall. But there's certainly, we have certainly modeled some things out in relation to the next fall. If certainly they're all moot right now because we might be back in June of this year.
Right about that.
But I do think it's important that we do, just like in a football game. I used this analogy earlier, but just the defense all of a sudden didn't show up in what you thought it was going to. And so consequently, you have to have contingency plans. There might not be your original plan. That's what a contingency obviously is. But you have to be prepared for every different scenario. And one of the things that I've been just, quite honestly, and instead of really digging our heels in on anything, I think that all the groups that I talk to, everybody is really working well together to try to make sure that we openly discuss all the contingencies and that we start developing models for that, and having several models for that same time frame. And that way, as we get closer to it, we can then start making a decision on the finality, the final model.
One of the final questions I have for you, Coach, is the conversations that are happening in terms of modeling with conference commissioners, with athletic directors, and some of the things you mentioned at the beginning, some of these committees that were created that the coaches are on to make sure the coaches have input. Are the coaches' voices heard when the conversations about the possibilities of this happening? I don't know if everybody understands the voice of the football coach or what actually influence the football coaches have on some of the directions that we may go with this college football season.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's any question that's being heard, and certainly in some areas more than others. We're not, as coaches, going to make the decisions on how many games we play this next year, when the season starts. I mean, that medical community is going to decide some of those kind of things. What I think our coaches have the expertise in, and where they've asked for our help, is what does that preseason model look like? How long does it take to get a team ready to go? What are the impacts in relation to recruiting? And from an academic standpoint, even with your student athletes and how that adjustment back to campus, I think those are the things where they're really leaning on our coaches, because that's where our expertise lies. And so while we might weigh in on other subjects, the reality is that we recognize as coaches that we're not going to determine the start date. And we don't need to get bogged down by the start date. We do need to get bogged down with how long it takes a team to safely prepare to play games. And that's our expertise, and that's where we're focusing our attention.
Yeah, I agree with that, Coach. You mentioned recruiting. I wonder about the conversations around recruiting. I mean, everything, I guess, once you have a date of all students going back to classes, I guess that will reverberate. If that decision is made on the college level, that means then that decision has been made possibly on the high school level and across the board. Recruiting in terms of that, obviously everything is virtual now, and I imagine there are discussions on what are the rules regarding recruiting and electronic communication. I mean, those kind of things. Is everything up in the air now? Like, what's happening in the recruiting world?
Yeah, it has turned things upside down a little bit in the sense that I think there are some milestones out there. Many of these young people that are even attending colleges next year for the first time, they missed the opportunity to qualify in relation to the ACT, SAT tests in the spring. There's a possibility that all of a sudden that could be impacted in the summer. So that impacts academics, but it certainly impacts the eligibility to go take official visits for those young people that are juniors right now, and they missed opportunities to go take unofficial visits and official visits in the spring. And so, one of the milestones I think that are out there right now is if the SAT, ACT tests happen in June. If they don't happen in June, then those next tests don't happen around until October. And so you've got a group of young people out there that maybe have never taken a test, which is one of the qualifiers for an official visit. And if that's the case, then all of a sudden, does it impact the early signing date? Because not only have the schools maybe not had the opportunity to evaluate transcripts and so on at the level that they would like to, but the young people had not had opportunities to go out and travel and take official visits and so on. And so I think that on all of the things that you talk to, whether it be recruiting or academics or football or whatever, there's some milestone dates out there that everyone is looking at that start really giving you some guidance in relation to saying, okay, which model should kick in? And I would suggest that June timeframe for ACT, SATs is going to be a huge part of that. Obviously, June camps or evaluation camps are probably gone at this point in time, I would suggest. And so do you move them to July? But if you move them to July, then all of a sudden you start impacting those young people's high school coaches and their abilities to get their own teams ready. And so there is an awful lot in the equation. There's a lot of, I think, some really good people that love the game and love the sport and are working diligently on this. And in relation to all the things being discussed, because of all the contingency plans, yeah, it's exponential.
Yeah, it is, and super dynamic, like you mentioned. And the last thing, I'm sorry, Coach, things just pop in my head as you talk, but there are some schools who are waiving ACT and SAT, and I wonder how that plays into, if that were to become a widespread thing, how does that play into a student athlete coming on recruiting, right? If the school is waiving it, I mean, and the NCAA requires it, talk to me about that's an interesting dynamic, right?
Yeah, I don't know that we're there yet in relation to making that decision, but I think that there's certainly been discussions about Latitude because we recognize that these young people in this class on a one-off, basically, they missed graduation, they missed prom, maybe they missed tests too, and so consequently, how do you handle some of their opportunities? And so I think there's got to be some consideration. What that ends up being, I don't know, because certainly we're not at that milestone date yet. But there needs to be some latitude in this one class, and probably even for the returning students, because maybe they had a summer school class that they needed for progress towards degree, and all of a sudden that summer school class isn't offered now because of the pandemic. How are you going to handle that? And so those things have all been discussed, though, and we have developed models for them based off some milestone dates or some direction. And as we move closer to those time frames and we know when that get back time is, then obviously those models will then be put to the forefront. And at that point in time, there'll be a decision on which model we're using.
I imagine the downhill motion of productivity will probably be a flurry exponentially of productivity when a date of when schools can open up or whatever. Like, this is probably going to be crazy. Everybody's going to be working. Everybody's going to be working like coaches work, right? 80, 90-hour weeks.
Well, that's why I think what we've tried to do, I think, is to say that about 6 weeks, we're working on 6 weeks increments right now. 6 weeks before it's time, then before we think there's going to be a return to maybe not normal, but a return, is that we put it out in relation to the model that we feel the most comfortable with. We give basically a couple weeks for any kind of vetting. And then basically a month out from the return, then we kind of have a finalized model for everyone to adjust to, get ready to, for all those kind of things. And so there's a month lead up to it. And, will we hit those dates exactly? I'm not sure if that'll be the case, but the reality of it, that's a plan. And I think that gives everyone a month. It gives everyone a chance to have some input for that 2-week time frame. And then it gives everybody a month to say, okay, here we go. And so hopefully that gives us enough of that downhill motion, as you mentioned, to where things aren't quite as much of a flurry and that people have a chance to kind of plan and prepare.
Yeah, well, Coach, like you, I obviously want there to be a football season. I don't think normal will be what we considered normal to the past, maybe for a couple of years before things stable out in terms of people having anxiety and people developing new habits over this time and then have to develop different habits when they start going out interacting with people. But I'll be excited when it all comes back, Coach. I really appreciate you joining us here on the One Question Leadership Podcast.
No, my pleasure, Ty, anytime.
That was Coach Todd Berry. He's the Executive Director of the American Football Coaches Association. And of course, this is Ty Brown with One Question. And keep in mind, the role of a leader is to create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of. And as always, be better tomorrow than you are today. This episode of the One Question Leadership Podcast is produced by Spades Media Group, solving problems using creative leadership.